We are in the study of 1 Corinthians. This morning we'll be starting in the 10th chapter with the 23rd verse. As we saw at the end of last week, Paul was telling the Corinthians that you can't be two-sided. You can't worship God and worship idols. And he was giving them reasons to stay away from idols, that certain things were okay, but not if they used them in a religious way. And he continues that thought here, beginning with the 23rd verse. He basically had just told them, you can't be friends with God and the world. You're going to have to make a choice. Then beginning in 23rd, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the grounds of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner, and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the grounds of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then out of consideration for the man who informed you and for conscience sake, his conscience, not yours, do not eat it. For why should my liberty be determined by another man's scruples? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please all men in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. He's told them before that you have rights, but if those rights are going to hurt someone else, then you need to just back off of that and don't do it. So he's continuing that thought. Even though they're lawful, even though legally, in God's legality, you're not talking about man's legal, he's talking about God's legal. You can do them. If they're not helpful, don't do them. Helpful to whom? Well, helpful to you, helpful to others, helpful in any way. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. That's a way to be helpful, to build up someone, to build up a situation, to build up an individual. So take a look at that, not just at legality. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. This is a good definition of agape, love. Being willing to give up my rights to take care of the needs of another. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. That forces the idea of what we talked about before. We need to know people. If you don't know your neighbor, how do you know his need? Now, the neighbor is not just the guy living next door, and we've seen that in the scriptures, but the neighbor is all those people out there that we can have an influence on. And so we know them, we look to their needs, we fill their needs. And then he goes into a part that fits the Corinthians because of the idol worship. And in that idol worship, many of the idols, they had to offer sacrifice to the idols, just as they did in Jewish times under the law of Moses. But their sacrifice could be many different things, could be different ways, could be burnt offerings, could be raw offerings. And many of the sacrifices to idols were raw offerings. They would kill the animal, and then take that meat to the market and sell it in the market. There were times that meat would sell as a premium because it would be marketed as having already been sacrificed to a certain idol. And that would make it more valuable to the person, because even though they might not have been involved in the sacrifice itself, they could be involved in the sacrifice by eating that meat. So sometimes they even got a premium for it, but quite often it was advertised as idol meat. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. You go to the meat market, and if they're not advertising it as idol meat, don't ask. You want that meat, buy it and eat it. Don't worry about it. For the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. Unbeliever, a non-Christian, invites you to dinner and you want to go eat with them, go ahead and eat. And don't ask any questions about what you're being served. My son, years ago, had in his business travels, had to travel to Malaysia and that part of the world quite often. And he said when he first went to Malaysia and they offered him something to eat, he'd say, "What is it?" And they'd tell him, and he just couldn't stomach it. So he finally learned, whatever they put down, don't ask. Just eat. Well, that's what we're being told here. Don't ask. Just eat. Now, that's if they don't say anything. But if someone says to you, "This has been offered to sacrifice," then out of consideration for the man who informed you and for conscience sake, I mean his conscience, not yours, do not eat it. Interesting statement. If you're served lamb and nobody says anything, eat the lamb and enjoy it. If you're served lamb and somebody says, "This is sacrifice meat," and they might be proud of it, they may be saying, "You're very rewarded in that you're getting to eat sacrifice meat." They also may be saying, "I know you're a Christian and you don't partake of this sacrifice meat, so I want you to know it's sacrifice meat." For whatever reason, if you're told it's sacrifice meat, then don't eat it. But I think the real interesting thing here is not don't eat it for your sake. Because still, even if you know it's sacrifice meat, it doesn't mean anything. As far as you're concerned, you can still eat it, no problem. But for the sake of the person who told you, now he's brought up a flag and says, you, for whatever reason, I know you need to know, you want to know this is sacrifice meat. So then you have to back off and say, "Okay, for your conscience sake, I don't want to offend you by eating sacrifice meat, so I'll back off of it." Now, what that brings out to us, there will be times that there will be things that we can legally do, but it might hurt somebody else and we have to back off. He keeps bringing that up. For why should my liberty be determined by another man's scruples? Isn't that an interesting question? I have liberty in Christ to do things, but because of someone else, I may not be able to do it. He says, why? Well, and then he says, I'll tell you why, down at the end of the chapter, that they may be saved. Into the 33rd verse. But disregarding the why, looking at the fact that our actions are not only determined by God's legality or our desires, but our actions are also determined or limited or restricted or brought about by someone else's feelings or their conscience. It's still the same today. Why should I be controlled by others so that they might be saved? It's the same answer. Now, we probably will not be invited to someone's house to eat sacrificed meat. But we may be invited to partake in things that are religious to them, and they're asking us to participate in it in a religious way, and we know that, and we have to refuse for their conscience sake. We lived in a neighborhood a few years ago that was about 85% Middle Eastern. And at some time in the year, that first year we were there, I don't remember what time of the year it happens, we were invited to a neighborhood, a community day. And so we asked them, what is it? And they said, well, it's Diwali. Diwali. I don't know how you pronounce it. We said, what's that? And they said, well, we just get together and we're going to eat and just have fun and get to know each other. Okay. So after we went and ate and got to know each other, we found out later that's not exactly right. That is an East Asian celebration of lights. That's what that means. And so I don't know that they were doing it on a religious basis. They gave no inclination during that there was any religion involved. They did not try to proselyte us into any religion. But after that, we really couldn't partake in that any more years after that. So you can get caught up in that today. There are things going on. If you are invited to do something religious with someone and they know it and they tell you, then he says, don't do it. Even though whatever it is might not be illegal in God's sight for you to do, if it were not being a religious aspect of something else. I hope that is sufficiently muddy. I've said enough words. For why should my liberty be determined by another man's scruples? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that which I give thanks? Well, apparently this was happening. That the denouncement was probably associated with the eating of meat, partaking of idols, for this particular situation in Corinth. 31, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. That's another answer to when Paul said, why? Why am I controlled by someone else's scruples? Because whatever you're going to do, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God. If we could make this a part of our life, we would be a long way ahead as a Christian. To live a life that gives no offense to anyone. Just as I try to please all men in everything, I do not seeking my own advantage, but that of many. And remember, Paul had said, to the Jews, I'm a Jew. To the Greeks, I'm a Greek. To the non-believers, I'm a non-believer. He went through all of that saying, I'll do what I have to do to make contact with people. And that's what he's finishing up here. I try to please all men in everything. Not to my advantage, but that they may be saved. Then he says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. That's chapter 11, verse 1, but in my mind it should be verse 34 in chapter 10, because it finishes up this thought. Paul says, this is what I'm going to do, and now you should do it also. Not because of me, but because I'm imitating Christ. So imitate me as I imitate Christ. Comments? Yes. Okay, good point. Tony's, if you couldn't hear him, Tony was saying Romans 8 is a parallel situation. We read that a few weeks ago, that within the church, we need to make sure that we don't cause a brother to stumble. We have to make sure that we do everything we can for those outside, but also for those within. And that's what he says here. Give no offense to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God. So we have to be careful with that. Thank you, Tony. Okay, beginning in chapter 11 now, beginning with the second verse. I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I have delivered them to you. I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions. That word traditions historically has been a red flag because of the Jews following the traditions of men rather than traditions of God. But traditions really is teachings. And there are traditions of God and there are traditions of men. In 2 Thessalonians, the 2nd chapter, the 15th verse, so then, brethren, stand firm and hold to the traditions which you were taught by us, either by word of mouth or by letter. And then in the 3rd chapter, the 6th verse, now we command you, brethren, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that you keep away from any brother living in idleness, not in accord with the traditions that you receive from us. So here is another teaching from Paul showing that there are traditions coming from God. And these we typically call apostolic traditions. The traditions, the teachings that come through the apostles. There are also man's traditions. In Galatians 1:14, Galatians 1:14, and I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my father. Here are those Jewish traditions that Paul said that he followed vigorously, but they were not God's traditions, they were man's traditions. And in Colossians 2, verse 8, see to it that no one makes a prey of you by philosophy and empty deceit according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the universe, and not according to Christ. So there are traditions of men, there are traditions of God. So what he's talking about here are the apostolic traditions, the traditions, the teachings, and that's what a tradition is, a teaching. The teachings that come from God. I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I have delivered them to you. I delivered them. I didn't develop them. They're not man's. They're God's. But as an apostle, I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Any man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a woman will not cover herself, then she should cut off her hair. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her wear a veil or a covering. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a woman ought to wear a covering on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that for a man to wear long hair is degrading to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her pride, for her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is disposed to be contentious, we recognize no other practice, nor do the churches of God. This is a section that has been grossly misunderstood through the ages. It has been misunderstood in that the context has been lost. And the context of all of Paul's words here is authority. That's what he's talking about. He has set up, he hadn't set it up, pardon me. He has shown us the hierarchical authority. God is over Christ, Christ is over man, man is over woman. That's something God set up. That's not something Bachelor Paul set up to make the women feel inferior. It has nothing to do with that. But the hierarchy is God, Christ, man, woman. Now, in that hierarchy, he brings in the situation of prayer. We're told in John 14:6 that no man comes to the Father but by me. This is Jesus. So our only access to God is through Jesus. Now, if we have this authority over us, God is the authority over Jesus. Jesus is the authority over man. So if man wants to pray, he prays directly to Jesus because there's no intervening factor. The authority is there directly. If a woman, or when a woman wants to pray, there has to be an intervening situation of authority in that she doesn't pray through the man. There is a veiling, there is a covering, there is a partition that veils off the man's authority so that she can pray directly to Christ. Without that covering of that authority, she would have no authority to go directly to Christ. She would go through man. God did not intend that. We're told that in Christ, all are the same. Jew, Greek, male, female, we're all one. So all being one, Paul is talking here about a situation of authority and prayer. We need to keep that in mind. Now he talks about covering and uncovering. And I couldn't find out exactly when it started. Sometime in the Middle Ages, and I can't find out exactly when, it became a law in the Roman Catholic Church that a woman would wear something on her head. It wasn't a veil. It could just be a hat. It could be a scarf. It could be a handkerchief. It could be something on her head. when you look at the words that he uses here for covering, it's talking about something. The Greek talks about something hanging down from the head, is what the word actually means. This went on in the Roman Catholic Church of some kind of covering for centuries. In the 1980s, the Roman Catholic Church changed their laws on this. Women no longer have to wear a covering on their head. So even in the religious organization that started a woman wearing something on her head, now they don't either. And when we look at this, that's not what it's talking about. When it talks about a veil or a covering, this word that it uses in here for veil is the same word that's used for the veil in the Holy of Holies in the temple. That veil that sealed off the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple, that same veil that was rent asunder when Christ was crucified. That's the kind of covering it's talking about, a veiling. So there again we get back to the authority issue, the veiling of the authority of the man over the woman, so the woman has access to Christ for prayer. That's what he's talking about here. Now he brings in the hair issue. And he says, if a woman has short cropped hair, if her covering is undone, is taken away, and he says here in the 15th verse, for her hair is given to her for a covering. So if that covering is taken away, she might as well just shave her head. Now, where did all that come from, Paul? Well, we have to remember the culture that the Corinthians are living in and the idol worshiping. The priestesses would crop their hair short. They would bob their hair or cut it very short, and that was a sign that they were a prostitute, they were a priestess, they were available for money, and that became a sign of prostitution. We remember back in the Jewish days, if a woman was convicted of prostitution, her head was shaven. Even in Germany in World War II, if a woman was caught in prostitution, her head, and in France, her head would be shaven. This would show that she was a prostitute. So part of that is coming from, now, these prostitutes were very popular in Corinth. So some of the women in Corinth began looking like the priestesses. They would cut their hair very short so that they would have the same look as a priestess, as an idol priestess. That became popular. And that's what Paul's talking about here. You don't want to look like an idol worshiper. You want to stay away from that when he's talking about hair. God gave you, women, he gave you hair for a covering, and that's what it's intended for. Then he said, nature shows that man doesn't wear long hair. Well, if a man's head has to be uncovered, there are a bunch of us that are in good shape. We don't have to worry about that. But that's what he's talking about here. And that's where all the confusion comes from. What he's saying is there's a hierarchy, there's authority, and there's ways around that authority, and those ways need to be preserved. So it never in here do any of these words portray a veiling, a fabric for a woman to wear, or an amount of fabric for a woman to wear. That's not what it's talking about. So we need to understand that. We just need to understand that God, Christ, man, woman. That's the way God set it up. And he says that that woman was made for man. We know that from Genesis. God had Adam look around and say, look around to everything and find yourself a helper. And he couldn't find one, so God made him a helper. And so that's the way he goes on and says, woman was made from man. Back in Genesis 1. Took a rib and made a woman. Then he says, but man is dependent on woman too, because women give birth to men. So there's a duplicity of interaction between a man and a woman. Does not change the hierarchical God, Christ, man, woman. Does not affect the equality of men and women in Christ. Whew. Yes. The whole body started out in BC time, and that we have no historical record of that being brought into the church anywhere. Yes, the total, I never can pronounce the name of it, the total veil that just has eye slits really became popular in about 800 AD. It was used before, but it wasn't really popular. And it became popular through the Islamic religions. And they developed it and made it popular in their religion. So that is a veil of sorts. That type of thing is not here. There's nothing in this that talks about that type of veiling, that type of material. But that was a custom and used at times. Yes, you're right. Yes. I can't hear you. Yes. The talking about, it says in here that that nature shows you that man should not have long hair. It's interesting, the pictures that we have now of Jesus all have shoulder-length hair and a big beard. The images, the pictures of Jesus for the first 300, 400, 500 years, 100 to 500 BC, he had short hair and no beard. I couldn't find why the change. But the men had close cropped hair. Now there's a good reason for it. Men were warriors. And battle back then was hand to hand, face to face, grab a hold of whatever you can grab a hold of and stick a knife in it. So you would not want a bunch of long hair hanging out that somebody grab a hold of and stick a knife through you. So there was a good reason for that, because of defensive mechanism. Also, it just seems to be that for whatever reason, he says nature itself shows that nature shows that man ought to have short hair. Yeah. Yes, sir. Okay? Yes, yes. Okay, let's move on. Beginning with the 17th verse. But in the following instructions, I do not commend you. Now remember, up in the second verse, he says, I commend you for following the traditions. Now in the 17th, but in the following instructions, traditions, I do not commend you. Because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you assemble as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. And I partly believe it. For there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. When you meet together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What, do you not have houses to eat and drink in, or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I command you in this? No, I will not. There's been a misunderstanding, I think, of this verse, so we need to understand what it's really saying. The following instructions you got a problem. For in the first place, when you assemble as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. This is a negative. Jesus prayed in John 17, Father, let them be one in me as I am in thee and thou art in me, that the world may believe. Jesus prayed for unity. And he says, there are divisions among you. Now he's going to talk about one of those divisions. For there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine may be recognized. Those refusing to join those factious cliques would be good examples to the congregation. The congregation would see that, would know that there are some staying true. 20, that was the first place. Now, second place, verse 20, when you meet together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal, and one is hungry and another is drunk. That's called the love feast. Has become known as the love feast. It was what we would call a potluck dinner. And it would be taken before, or it would be eaten before the church service. So it was a come together, let's eat, and then we'll have service. And it became known as the love feast. But what happened, what began to happen and what developed was the rich brought most of the stuff. The poor didn't have anything to bring. So the rich would bring the food, the poor would come to eat. But the rich would get there early, they would spread it out, and they would eat it all themselves. And then when the poor got there was nothing left for them. This is what was happening. This is not talking about the Lord's Supper. This is talking about what we call the love feast. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal, and one is hungry and another is drunk. They didn't share that meal with everybody. And they did it to excess. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? You don't need to come together and do this. This is something you want to do. If you're going to do it, then do it right. But you don't need to do it. You have houses you can eat in. You can eat before you come. Or you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? Or are you really looking to say, look how great I am. I brought a whole half a hog, and I bought 5 bushels of corn already cooked, and it's all ready to eat. And look how good I am, how great I am. I'm really sorry about you poor people not having anything, but at least I brought something. That's what he's talking about. What shall we say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. We have 5 minutes left, but really beginning with the 23rd verse, now we begin talking about the Lord's Supper. So I think rather than starting it and having to break in the middle, we're just going to go ahead and take a stop. Any comments or questions before we stop? Yes. I can't hear you, Sandy. Sandy, what's your question? We're getting lost in all of this. What's the point? No, that's not what he's saying at all. He's saying that this is what I've taught you, this is what I've taught you, and if anyone doesn't go along with this, be contentious. We recognize no other practice. There's no other way to look at this except this authority figure, God, Christ, man, woman. This is the way it is, and there's no other practice. Nor do any other the churches other than Corinth, neither do any other the churches have any other practice either. He's saying this is a unified look. It's not just for Corinth. This teaching from 2 down through 16 is applicable to the entire church. Yes. Yes. Okay. Anything else? All right, we'll begin with the 23rd verse of the 11th chapter next week. Thank you.